After a lot of speculation, it's finally official. Kamala Harris is Joe Biden's running mate. So how did the senator go from prosecutor to vice presidential candidate? Let's rewind to 1964. Harris was born in Oakland, California, to immigrant parents. Her father was from Jamaica and taught at Stanford. Her mother moved from India, later becoming a scientist and activist.
My mother was the toughest, the smartest, and the most loving person I've ever known.
Fast forward to the 80s, Harris studied poli-sci and economics at Howard University. She later got her law degree at UC Hastings. Her career kicked off in 1990 as a deputy district attorney in Alameda County.
Of course, I decided to become a prosecutor because I felt, I felt and I still feel a very strong sense of responsibility to protect those who are vulnerable.
By 2004, Harris had won her first election, DA of San Francisco. There, she crafted a prisoner reentry initiative while also launching a controversial program that prosecuted parents who let their kids regularly skip school. Harris also raised her city's conviction rate, eventually leading to blowback that she was too tough on crime, particularly in communities of color.
It is a myth to say that African Americans don't want law enforcement. We do. What we don't want is racial profiling. What we don't want is excessive force.
That's right.
What we don't want is to have our civil liberties and civil rights be stripped.
It's a belief she still defends today.
Let's talk about a myth. A myth that black people don't want public safety. That is simply not true. And what we don't want is racial profiling or chokeholds or mass incarceration.
Harris ran for California Attorney General in 2010, beating her opponent by less than a percentage point. She was the first woman and first black American to get the job.
And I now stand before you as the top cop of the biggest state in the country.
She fought against mortgage fraud and Prop 8, which bans same-sex marriage. But critics say she should have pushed for more criminal justice reform or supported policies like legalizing marijuana, especially given this interview on The Breakfast Club years later.
Have you ever smoked?
I have.
Okay. Like in
And
college,
I inhaled. I did inhale.
Was it a blunt or joint?
It was a joint.
In 2014, Harris married lawyer Doug Emhoff and became stepmom, or mamala, to his 2 kids. This was around the time she announced her Senate campaign. She won the race the same night Trump became president-elect. And yet again, she made history. Not only is she the first Indian American senator, but she's also one of the 2 black women ever elected to the Senate.
I could not be more proud to represent my beautiful state.
Harris wrote bills with senators across the aisle, focusing on things like bail reform and immigration. She also became known for her ability to grill witnesses.
Is that policy in writing somewhere?
I think so.
So did you not consult it before you came before this committee, knowing we would ask you questions about it?
Well, we talked about it. The policy is
Did you ask that it would be shown to you?
The policy is based on the principle that the president...
Sir, I'm not asking about the principle. I'm asking when you would be asked these questions and you would rely on that policy. Did you not ask your staff to show you the policy that would be the basis for you refusing to answer the majority of questions that have been asked?
Should be allowed to answer the question.
Then, in January of 2019, this announcement.
I'm running to be president of the people, by the people, and for all people.
Harris promoted Medicare for all and tuition-free college during the campaign. Her poll numbers surged during the first Democratic debate when she called out Biden for opposing busing during the 1970s.
There was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools, and she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
Donations poured in after that night, but the enthusiasm didn't last forever. She dropped from the race in December after running out of money. And despite those seriously contentious debates, Harris ended up endorsing Biden earlier this year.
One of the things that we need right now is we need a leader who really does care about the people and who can therefore unify the people. And I believe Joe can do that.
And clearly, Biden believes Harris can help pave the path to the White House.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.